In the quiet, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, a ghost army was assembling under the cover of heavy mist and absolute radio silence. The Third Reich was moving the last remnants of its armored might into position. It was a logistical miracle, a sleight of hand that fooled the combined intelligence services of the United States and Great Britain. The Allies believed Germany was beaten, a boxer staggering on the ropes waiting for the final bell. They were wrong. Germany was coiling for one last, lethal strike. But while the soldiers in the foxholes were preparing for a masterstroke of tactical surprise, the men in the high command were preparing for a strategic suicide. If you want to understand how a nation can be brilliant at battle but terrible at war, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are about to dissect the anatomy of a disaster. To understand why the last plan was doomed, we have to look at the map table in the Eagle's Nest in September 1944. Hitler was trembling, not with fear, but with a manic energy. The Allied armies had swept through France and were knocking on the door of the Reich. In the east, the Soviet steamroller had paused on the Vistula. Hitler saw this pause as his final window of opportunity. He conceived a plan so audacious that his own generals thought he had lost his mind. He wanted to launch a massive panzer offensive through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes, the same route used in 1940, to split the British and American armies, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital supply port Antwerp. His logic was political, not military. He believed that if he could inflict a colossal defeat on the Western Allies, capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the democratic governments in London and Washington would collapse. He thought the unnatural alliance between the capitalists in the West and the communists in the East would fracture. He imagined that by breaking the Americans, he could force a negotiated peace in the West and turn all his fury back to the East to stop Stalin. But this plan, codenamed Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, was built on a foundation of sand. It required three conditions to succeed: total surprise, terrible weather to ground the overwhelming Allied Air Force, and the capture of American fuel supplies to keep the German tanks moving. If any one of these failed, the operation would fail. It was not a strategy. It was a poker game where Germany pushed its last chips into the pot on a pair of twos, hoping the other side would fold. General Gerd von Rundstedt and General Walter Model, the two most experienced commanders in the West, tried to talk him out of it. They proposed a small solution, a limited attack to pinch off the American salient at Aachen. It was sensible. It was achievable. It would conserve resources. Hitler rejected it instantly. He wanted the big solution. He wanted Antwerp. He stripped the Eastern Front of its best divisions. He pulled the Luftwaffe's last reserves from the defense of the Reich's oil refineries. He gathered 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks. The tragedy of this buildup was the delusion of the timeline. The plan assumed the German army could move as fast in 1944 as it did in 1940. But the Wehrmacht of 1944 was not the Greyhound of 1940. It was a wounded bear. The horses were tired. The trucks were running on wood gas generators. The soldiers were a mix of hardened SS veterans and terrified teenagers from a Volkssturm. They were being asked to advance 100 miles in a week through snow against the most mobile army in the world. As the launch date of December 16th approached, the secrecy was absolute. The Germans moved only at night. They used straw to muffle the sound of tank tracks on the roads. The Allies, lulled into a false sense of security, staffed the Ardennes sector with tired divisions resting from battle and green units fresh from the States. They called it the Ghost Front because nothing ever happened there. Intelligence officers ignored the reports of engine noises in the night. They ignored the warnings from civilians. They were victims of their own success, unable to conceive that a defeated enemy could launch an offensive of this magnitude. The stage was set for the greatest intelligence failure of the war for the Americans, and the greatest strategic gamble for the Germans. The last plan was ready. It had the surprise. It had the weather. But it lacked the one thing that matters most in modern warfare: the logistical capacity to sustain the blow. The German tanks sitting in the Eifel forest had enough fuel for perhaps 100 miles. Antwerp was 125 miles away. They were starting a marathon with enough water for a sprint, hoping to steal a drink from the spectators along the way. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ghost Front was shattered by the roar of 1,600 German artillery pieces. The earth shook, trees splintered. Inside their dugouts, young American soldiers, many of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger, woke up to the apocalypse. The last plan had begun, and its initial fury was terrifyingly effective. If you enjoy witnessing the chaos of the first hours of battle, hit that like button to support our deep dives into military history. The offensive was led by 3 armies. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, tasked with the main effort to capture Antwerp. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Otto von Manchefeld, aiming for Brussels. And in the south, the 7th Army, protecting the flank. The sheer weight of the attack crushed the thin American line. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the U.S., was encircled and surrendered. 2 regiments wiped out in days, the second largest surrender of U.S. troops in the war. For a moment, it looked like 1940 all over again. Confusion reigned. American communications were cut. German commandos, led by Otto Skorzeny and dressed in American uniforms, infiltrated behind the lines, changing road signs and cutting telephone wires. Rumors spread that they were going to assassinate General Eisenhower in Paris. The panic was real. This was a shock Hitler had counted on. But almost immediately, the last plan began to unravel due to the friction of reality. The roads in the northern sector, where the elite SS Panzer divisions were attacking, were narrow, twisting, and icy. The sheer number of German vehicles created massive traffic jams. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the spearhead of the entire operation, found itself stuck behind horse-drawn artillery. The timetable, which was calculated in hours, began to slip into days. Then there was the resistance. The plan relied on the Americans running away. But small, isolated groups of GIs, often cut off from their headquarters, refused to run. At a place called Lanzerath, a single platoon of 18 men from the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon held up an entire German parachute battalion for a whole day. At Elsenborn Ridge, the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions dug in and refused to budge. They jammed the northern shoulder of the German advance. This was the critical flaw in Hitler's calculation. He believed the American soldier was soft, a product of a mongrel race that lacked fighting spirit. He was wrong. The Americans were flexible, improvised quickly, and fought with stubborn tenacity. By holding the shoulders of the breakthrough, they forced the Germans into a narrow funnel. The Bulge was being created, not as a spear thrust of the sea, but as a congested sack. The weather was indeed terrible, grounding the Allied Air Force as predicted. A thick blanket of fog and low clouds covered the battlefield. This protected the German columns from the dreaded J-Bose fighter bombers. But the weather fought the Germans too. The thaw turned the dirt roads into mud soup. Tanks slid off icy embankments. The 6th Panzer Army, the pride of the Reich, was barely moving. Meanwhile, the spirit of the attack, Camp Grubpaper, led by the ruthless Joachim Paper, was racing west. They were leaving a trail of blood, massacring American prisoners at Malmedy. This atrocity, intended to spread terror, instead hardened the resolve of the American troops. Word spread down the line. No surrender. The SS are taking no prisoners. The resistance stiffened. By the 3rd day, the last plan was already behind schedule. The Germans hadn't crossed the Meuse. They hadn't captured the massive fuel depots they needed. They were burning their limited gasoline idling in traffic jams or fighting for crossroads that should have been bypassed. The element of strategic surprise had worked, but the tactical execution was drowning in the mud of the Ardennes. The clock was ticking, and the giant, the Allied armies on the flanks, was beginning to wake up. In the center of the offensive, the 5th Panzer Army was having more success than the SS in the north, but they were about to run into a problem named St. Vith. This small market town was a nexus of roads, a vital artery that the Germans absolutely needed to move their supplies west. It was defended by a scrap-heap collection of American units, battered engineers, and the remnants of the 7th Armored Division. The battle for this town would prove that maps do not fight wars. Men do. Make sure you are subscribed to our channel to follow the turning of the tide. General Manchefeld was a brilliant tactician. He had bypassed the American strong points and filtered his tanks through the gaps. But he couldn't bypass St. Vith indefinitely. The roads all led through it. If the Americans held it, they choked the German supply lines. The defense of St. Vith was a masterclass in delaying action. For days, the American defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, traded space for time. They fell back from one ridge to the next, blowing bridges and felling trees across the roads. Every hour they held St. Vith was an hour the German panzers were not moving toward Antwerp. This delay was fatal for the last plan. The German timetable was so tight that it allowed for zero friction. Hitler had assumed the roads would be open. He hadn't counted on American engineers. These men were the unsung heroes of the battle. They rigged bridges with explosives and waited until the lead German tank was on the span before blowing it. They created roadblocks that forced the massive Tiger II tanks to stop. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was a fearsome weapon, 70 tons of steel with a gun that could kill anything on the battlefield. But in the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes, it was a liability. It was too wide for the bridges. It guzzled fuel at an insane rate, gallons per mile. When a Tiger ran out of fuel or through a track, it became a 70-ton roadblock for the entire column behind it. The Americans realized they didn't have to destroy the tanks. They just had to destroy the road in front of them. While the battle raged, the Allied High Command was reacting. Eisenhower, realizing the scale of the attack, made a crucial decision. He treated the situation not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. The Germans have come out of their holes, he said. He saw that by extending their neck into the Bulge, the Germans were exposing themselves to a devastating counterattack. He ordered General George Patton, commanding the Third Army in the south, to do the impossible. He told Patton to stop his attack into the Saar, turn his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and drive into the German flank. Most generals would have said it would take weeks. Patton said he could do it in 48 hours. The German intelligence had deemed such a maneuver impossible. They believed the Allies were too slow, too bureaucratic. They didn't understand the mobility of the U.S. Army. As the Germans battered themselves against St. Vith, the hammer was being raised in the south. By the time the Germans finally captured St. Vith on December 21st, it was a hollow victory. The defenders had withdrawn intact. The delay had allowed the Allies to reinforce the shoulders of the penetration and, most importantly, to rush the 101st Airborne Division to the next vital road junction, a town called Bastogne. The race was on, but the Germans were running on fumes, and the Americans were bringing in the cavalry. Bastogne, the name is now legendary, but in December 1944, it was just a dot on the map where 7 roads met. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the southern road network of the Ardennes. The Germans needed it to secure their supply lines. The Americans needed it to break the German wave. The collision at this town became the defining moment of the entire battle. If you love stories of gritty defiance against overwhelming odds, hit the bell icon to get updates on our next series. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, arrived in Bastogne just hours ahead of the German Panzer Lehr Division. They were light infantry. They had no tanks, little artillery, and no winter clothing. They were surrounded almost immediately. The last plan now hinged on cracking this nut. The siege of Bastogne was a nightmare. The German forces pounded the town with artillery and encircled it completely. Inside the perimeter, the paratroopers were running low on ammunition and food. The medical stations were overwhelmed. The temperature dropped to record lows, but the morale held. On December 22nd, the German commander sent 4 emissaries under a white flag to the American headquarters. They carried a note demanding the surrender of the town to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. The acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the note and muttered a single word: "Nuts." That was the official reply sent back to the Germans, to the German commander. Nuts, the American commander. The Germans were confused. Is that negative or affirmative? They asked. The American officer escorting them explained, "It means go to hell." This moment of defiance was more than just bravado. It was a strategic pivot. It signaled that the psychological shock of the offensive had worn off. The Germans weren't facing a demoralized enemy. They were facing an enemy that was mocking them. Strategically, the siege of Bastogne was a disaster for the Germans. Instead of bypassing the town and racing for the Meuse, they were sucked into a battle of attrition they couldn't afford. They diverted tank divisions that were meant for Antwerp to try and crush the paratroopers. The last plan was losing its focus. The spearhead was blunted. Meanwhile, the fuel crisis hit. Camp Grupp paper, the tip of the German spear, had run out of gas. Paper had been tantalizingly close to a massive American fuel dump containing millions of gallons, but the American engineers had set it on fire before he could capture it. On foot in the snow, the elite SS troopers looked at their dry tanks, the most advanced weapons of the war, and realized they were useless. They abandoned 150 vehicles and walked back toward Germany. The failure to capture Bastogne and the failure to capture fuel meant the offensive was dead in the water. The German tanks were now static pillboxes, and in the south, George Patton's Third Army was coming. Driving through snowstorms, without sleep, the American tanks smashed into the German flank on December 26, breaking the siege of Bastogne. The corridor was open. The trap had failed. On December 23rd, a miraculous thing happened. The wind shifted. The heavy gray blanket of clouds that had covered the Ardennes for a week suddenly broke apart. The sun came out. For the German soldiers on the ground, this was not a blessing. It was a death sentence. The last plan had relied entirely on bad weather. Now, the skies belonged to the Allies. Don't forget to subscribe to see how air power changed the face of war. The Allied air forces unleashed hell. Thousands of aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, Typhoons, Mustangs, descended on the German columns. The roads of the Ardennes, clogged with stalled German traffic, became bowling alleys. The fighter-bombers strafed and bombed everything that moved. German tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons were smashed into burning scrap. The Germans had no answer. The Luftwaffe, which Hitler had promised would support the attack, was nowhere to be seen. The supply lines, already strained by the partisans and the weather, were now cut completely. A German tank commander could not move his vehicle in daylight without being destroyed. The offensive didn't just stop. It evaporated under the rain of high explosives. In a final, desperate attempt to regain the initiative in the air, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. It was a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Almost 1,000 German fighters took off at dawn. Tactically, they destroyed hundreds of Allied planes on the ground. But strategically, it was the final nail in the coffin of the German Air Force. The German pilots were inexperienced. They flew low over their own anti-aircraft lines, which hadn't been warned of the operation. German flak gunners shot down their own planes. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 pilots, including many of their surviving aces and squadron leaders. The Allies could replace their planes in a week. The Luftwaffe could never replace those pilots. Bodenplatte was the death rattle of German air power. With the skies clear and the ground forces stalled, the Bulge became a shooting gallery. The Allied armies began to squeeze the pocket from the north and south. The Germans were now fighting just to escape. The last plan had turned into a desperate evacuation. The elite panzer divisions, which were supposed to be parading in Antwerp, were now fighting rearguard actions to save their skins. The decision to launch this operation in the face of absolute Allied air superiority, once the weather cleared, highlights the disconnect in Hitler's mind. He was fighting a war of the 19th century, looking for a decisive battle on the ground, while ignoring the 20th century reality that you cannot win on the ground if you lose the sky. The clearing of the weather didn't change the outcome of the battle. It just accelerated the inevitable massacre. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge had been flattened. The front line was back to where it had been in December. To the casual observer looking at a map, it might seem like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The last plan had succeeded only in shortening the war by destroying the very forces Germany needed to prolong it. As we conclude this analysis, verify that you are subscribed. You won't want to miss our breakdown of the final collapse of Berlin. The cost of the Battle of the Bulge was catastrophic for Germany. They suffered 100,000 casualties and lost nearly all their remaining tanks and aircraft. But the real cost was strategic. These were the reserves that were meant to defend the Eastern Front against the Soviets. In January 1945, just as the Bulge was collapsing, the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive on the Vistula. They faced a German front that had been stripped of its armor to feed Hitler's gamble in the West. The Soviets smashed through the German lines and didn't stop until they were 40 miles from Berlin. If the 6th Panzer Army had been dug in on the Vistula instead of freezing in the Ardennes, they might have held the Soviets back for months. They might have bought time for refugees to escape. Instead, the last plan burned the last insurance policy of the Third Reich. It left the door to the East wide open. It also depleted the fuel reserves to such an extent that the Wehrmacht effectively ceased to be a mobile army. From February 1945 onwards, German tanks were largely static, towed into position by horses or abandoned on the roadside. The operation also proved the resilience of the Allied alliance. Far from splitting the British and Americans, the crisis brought them closer, despite some squabbling between Montgomery and Bradley. The American army emerged from the battle with a new confidence. They had taken Germany's best shot and remained standing. They had proven that a democracy could fight with the same ferocity as a dictatorship. Why did the plan come too late? It wasn't just about the date. It was too late because the strategic context had already shifted irrevocably. The industrial disparity was too great. The fuel shortage was too acute. The air superiority was too absolute. Launching a massive offensive in 1944 was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. It was an act of delusion, born from a leader who could not accept that the game was over. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a monument to the waste of war. The courage of the soldiers on both sides was undeniable, but for the Germans, it was courage spent in service of a fantasy. The last plan didn't buy Germany time. It spent Germany's future. It ensured that the end, when it came, would be total, absolute, and utterly devastating. The snow of the Ardennes melted in the spring of 1945, revealing the wreckage of an army that had been ordered to achieve the impossible and died trying. Thank you for watching this detailed documentary series. If you want to understand the Soviet offensive that followed this battle, click the video on your screen about the Vistula Oder offensive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history.